Fold out the chart at the back of the book, and you are looking at a family reduced to shapes. Squares for the men, circles for the women, thin lines dropping from a single name at the top, and then splitting into two separate futures. On one side, the symbols are left clean and open. On the other side, they are filled in solid black, and inside each black shape sits a single letter, F, for feeble-minded. The chart was printed in 1912, and for the next 30 years, it traveled through American classrooms and courtrooms and government hearing rooms as something close to hard proof. It seemed to show that everything the comfortable classes feared, low intelligence, crime, poverty, what that era bluntly called immorality, ran down one bloodline like a stain that could never wash out. And then, decades later, a handful of researchers went looking for the real people hidden behind those black symbols. They found names. They found census pages and land deeds and parish records, and the tidy story, printed on the chart, stopped holding together in their hands. This is how a drawing became evidence, and what was actually on the page. The drawing has a name, the Kallikak family tree, and the word Kallikak is not a real surname at all. The psychologist who published it built the name out of two Greek words, kalos, meaning good, and kakos, meaning bad, and he welded them into one invented family so that both halves of his argument would sit together on a single sheet of paper. That one detail tells you a great deal about how the study was made. The conclusion came first, and the family was arranged afterward to carry it. But to understand how a scientist talked an entire nation into a poisoned bloodline, you have to begin where he began, with one young woman inside an institution in New Jersey, a woman the book calls Deborah, and a question her own caretakers could not answer. The institution was the Vineland Training School in the flat farmland of southern New Jersey, a campus of brick buildings that took in children the outside world had already given up on. In 1897, a girl of about 8 arrived there out of an almshouse, one of those grim county poorhouses where the most destitute people in the region were warehoused together, with nowhere else to go. The records at Vineland call her Deborah, and she would stay inside that place for the rest of her life. By the everyday standards of the school, Deborah was far from helpless. She learned to read a little, to write, and to count. She could sew well enough to make clothing for herself and for other people. She carried wood and filled the kettles. She could play music by ear, and in time she picked up a cornet and joined the institution band. As a grown woman, she did careful woodwork. She stitched dresses that people genuinely admired. She wrote her own stories in shaky, unschooled spelling, and she ran the school gymnasium, building costumes and painting the sets for the little theatrical shows the residents staged. Years afterward, a visitor who spent real time with her said that if you simply met her, you would not think anything was wrong. And yet the man who ran the research laboratory at Vineland looked at Deborah and saw a defect that demanded an explanation. His name was Henry Herbert Goddard, and he was fast becoming one of the most influential psychologists in America. Goddard had just carried a new instrument back across the Atlantic from Europe, an intelligence test built in France by Alfred Binet, and he had started running it on the children in his care. When he tested Deborah, the score came back low. On paper, a woman of 21 was assigned the mind of a 9-year-old child. Goddard even had a fresh label for people who fell into that range, a word he had personally coined 2 years earlier from the Greek for dull or sluggish. He called them morons. Today, it is only an insult. In 1910, it was being introduced as a clinical category, and Goddard was the man introducing it. It is worth being clear about what that test actually did, because the whole tragedy turns on it. The Binet scale measured how a child performed on a set of school-like tasks and reported the result as a mental age, a rough comparison against the average child at each year. Binet himself had built it as a tool to spot pupils who needed extra help, a temporary snapshot meant to guide teaching. Goddard did something with it that Binet never intended. He treated that single mental age number as a fixed and permanent measure of a person's inborn worth. In his hands, one afternoon's performance quietly hardened into a lifelong sentence. So he had a puzzle on his hands. Deborah could do all of those practical things, and still his test insisted she was defective underneath. To Goddard, that low score outweighed everything she could actually accomplish. The defect was real, he decided, hidden below her ordinary competence. And it had to have come from somewhere. It had to have been inherited. And if it was inherited, then it had a history stretching back behind her. Somewhere in the past of this one young woman, he was certain, there had to be a whole family shaped like her score. To go find that family, Goddard needed someone willing to walk the back roads and look for it. He found her in a field worker named Elizabeth Kite. Kite was not a physician. She had no medical training and no laboratory bench. What she had was time, a notebook, and the same set of assumptions her employer held. And Goddard sent her out into the rural districts of New Jersey to trace Deborah's ancestry backward, one generation at a time, and to write down whatever she uncovered. This is the part that sounds strangest to a modern ear, so it is worth slowing all the way down. In the early 1900s, the notion that you could chart a family's defects the way a botanist charts a species was not a crank belief on the edge of things. It was treated as advanced science. Researchers had already produced celebrated studies of what they called degenerate families. One earlier project had followed a clan nicknamed the Jukes across generations of paupers and criminals, and presented the whole thing as a pedigree, using the very same diagrams that livestock breeders used for their animals. The reasoning felt airtight from the inside. If intelligence was carried in the blood, then feeble-mindedness was carried in the blood too. And if that much was true, you ought to be able to watch it march straight down a family tree. All you had to do was go out and find the tree. So Kite went knocking. She visited farmhouses and one-room shacks. She sat with elderly people and asked them about dead relatives. She gathered gossip and half-remembered rumors about who had been slow, who had been a drunk, who had been born outside of marriage, who had drifted into the poorhouse. And as she gathered, she judged. She would look at a living person, or merely listen to a second-hand description of a dead one, and she would decide whether that person had been feeble-minded. Then she recorded that decision as though it were a finding. Sit with what that actually means. The raw data underneath one of the most cited hereditary studies in American history was, to a large degree, a well-dressed stranger standing in a doorway, deciding by appearance and by reputation who was defective and who was sound. There was no test out in the field. There was only Kite's impression, and Kite already knew, before she ever arrived, precisely what her employer expected this family to look like. And she was hardly a neutral observer showing up with an open question. Kite had been trained, in effect, to recognize feeble-mindedness on sight, schooled in the belief that it left visible marks on a face and on a household. What she carried into those homes was her own conviction, already certain of what defect looked like, and that certainty could only ever confirm itself. A sagging porch, a dirty child, a vacant expression. Each of them could be read straight through into a diagnosis before a single word was ever exchanged. Out of all those visits, a shape slowly emerged. Kite followed Deborah's line back through several generations until she arrived at one particular man, a soldier from the era of the American Revolution. And it was around that single ancestor that Goddard would construct the entire architecture of his book. Because according to the account Kite carried home, this one man had not founded a single family. He had founded two. Here is the story exactly as Goddard told it, and it matters to hear it as his claim, rather than as established fact, because every later problem grows straight out of this account. The soldier, whom Goddard concealed behind the invented name Martin Kallikak, was a young man during the war, and as a young man, the story goes, he had a brief encounter with a girl he met at a tavern, a girl Goddard describes only as nameless and feeble-minded. She became pregnant. The soldier moved on with his life. The girl bore a son and gave that boy the soldier's name, and from that one illegitimate child, Goddard claimed, descended a long chain of the poor, the criminal, the drunk, and the defective. That was the black side of the chart. Goddard counted 480 descendants along it, and he reported that 143 of them were, in his own phrase, conclusively feeble-minded, while only 46 could be found clearly normal. Then the story continues. The soldier came home from the war and did the respectable thing. He married a Quaker woman from a good family, and out of that marriage came the other branch. 496 people Goddard described as almost uniformly upstanding, the doctors and lawyers and judges and landowners who ran their towns. That was the clean side of the chart. One man, two women, two bloodlines, one supposedly rotten at the root and one supposedly sound to the core. Goddard offered this as something close to a controlled experiment that nature itself had kindly run for him. The same father, crossed with two different kinds of woman, with the results laid out across a full century for anyone to read. That was the real power of the Kallikak story. Goddard put it forward as proof that the quality of your mind was fixed inside your blood before you drew a single breath, and that no school and no church and no amount of effort could ever scrub it back out. And notice carefully what got studied and what did not. Kite and Goddard poured their energy into documenting the bad branch, chasing down every last rumor of a defective cousin. The good branch, they mostly accepted on faith. Nobody went knocking on the doors of the respectable Kallikaks with that same hungry suspicion, testing whether the judges and the landowners were hiding their own drinkers and their own cheats and their own difficult children. Only one side of this family was ever truly investigated, and it happened to be the exact side the whole theory needed to come out looking bad. A story like that does not spread across a country because it is true. It spreads because a great many people badly want it to be true. And in 1912, an enormous number of powerful Americans wanted precisely this. The country was crowded and anxious and changing at frightening speed. Millions of immigrants were pouring through Ellis Island. Cities were swelling with poor families. Crime and drinking and poverty felt, to the comfortable classes, like rising water they could not explain and could not stop. And here came a credentialed scientist with a clean, simple answer. The problem was not the economy, or the housing, or the schools, or plain bad luck. The problem was blood. Certain people were simply born defective. They were breeding faster than everyone else. And the answer was not more charity, but more control. That was the beating heart of the eugenics movement, and eugenics in the 1910s and 20s was nothing like a whispered fringe cause. It was taught in major universities. It was funded by some of the wealthiest foundations in the nation. It was preached approvingly from respectable stages and pulpits. There was a particular fear driving all of this, and Goddard did as much as anyone alive to spread it. According to the movement, the gravest danger to the nation's stock was not obvious at all. A person with a severe, visible disability was easy to identify and easy to pity. The people to be afraid of, the argument ran, were the so-called high-grade defectives, the morons, who looked and spoke completely normally and could move through the world unnoticed, marrying and working and raising children, passing a hidden defect quietly down the line. That fear is precisely why Deborah made such a useful emblem. She could sew and read and play music, and to Goddard, that surface competence was the frightening part, because it was exactly the kind of ordinary-looking capability that could let a defect travel undetected from one generation to the next. And the Kallikak family handed that whole movement its perfect fable. The book was short and readable. It had a hero, and its dark mirror image, and it arrived stamped with the authority of a working psychologist and a real scientific institution. It ran through 12 printings. It settled into textbooks, where a rising generation learned the very concept of heredity by memorizing the two branches of a family that had been made up. It got quoted in fights over who should be permitted to marry, who should be let into the country, and who should be allowed to have children at all. And Goddard did not stay safely behind his laboratory door. In 1913, he sent assistants to Ellis Island, to that vast hall where new arrivals waited in long lines beneath the tall windows, and he had them pick out immigrants who looked defective and put them through versions of his intelligence test. Those tests were pushed on exhausted, frightened people, often in a language they barely spoke, by examiners who had already decided from clear across the room who looked feeble-minded. Goddard published the results as if they were solid, reporting that an astonishing share of certain immigrant groups were mentally defective, and those numbers were promptly picked up and used as ammunition to argue that America was being swamped with damaged human stock. Follow the machine that is quietly being assembled here. One girl at Vineland becomes a family tree. The family tree hardens into a scientific law. The scientific law becomes a test waiting at the border. The test at the border becomes a reason to shut people out of the country entirely. At every stage, the new claim borrowed its authority from the stage just before it. And almost nobody along the chain ever stopped to ask whether that very first step, the original judgment about that first young woman, had been sound to begin with. So let us finally ask it directly. Was that first step sound? Start with the word sitting at the dead center of everything, feeble-minded. Today it lands as a plain insult, and it was already doing cruel work back in 1912, but Goddard deployed it as though it were a precise medical category, something you could confirm the way you confirm a broken bone on an X-ray. It was nothing of the sort. Feeble-mindedness, as that era swung it around, was an enormously wide net. It caught people with genuine intellectual disabilities. It also caught the poor, the unschooled, unmarried mothers, rebellious teenagers, immigrants who tested badly in a foreign language, and very nearly anyone whose behavior offended middle-class respectability. And once you were tangled inside that net, almost any fact about your life could be read backward as a symptom of it. Now recall how the diagnoses out in the field were genuinely being made. There was no doctor involved, and no test administered. The judgment came from Elizabeth Kite, standing in a doorway, forming a snap impression, frequently about people who were already dead and could only be sketched by their neighbors. A dead man remembered as a heavy drinker became a defective. A poor woman with too many children became a defective. A house that merely looked wretched became evidence of a wretched mind living inside it. Poverty was being read straight off as biology. The ordinary conditions that flow from having no money, the bad housing, and the poor food, and the total lack of schooling, were being written down as proof of an inherited flaw, when they are at the very least just as easily explained by the plain fact of being broke. And running underneath all of it was the most basic flaw in the entire method. Goddard and Kite already knew exactly what they were hunting for. They went out specifically to find defect in the bad branch, and so, inevitably, they found it, in every shadow and every second-hand rumor. If you walk into every home already convinced the family is rotten, and you count every mark and every whisper as more proof of the rot, you cannot possibly come back carrying any other answer. A study that can only ever confirm the thing it assumed at the start has proven nothing whatsoever. Even the founding scene, the tavern girl herself, will not bear any weight when you lean on it. Goddard never named her. He produced no birth record, no marriage record, no death record, nothing at all that a later researcher could pull and check. The entire poisoned half of this family hangs off one anonymous woman who steps into the story just long enough to be blamed for everything, and then disappears completely. For a book that dressed itself up as hard science, the origin of its central claim was a scrap of folklore with no paper anywhere behind it. And none of this was buried in some secret code. It was sitting right there in the book the whole time, plainly visible to anyone willing to read the method instead of the conclusion. The trouble was that hardly anyone wanted the method. They wanted the chart. Which carries us right back to that chart, because now we can finally see what it truly is. Look at it one more time. Every one of those black symbols, every square and circle filled in solid to mark a defective member of the bad branch, looks exactly like a data point. It looks like a measurement, as firm and objective as a recorded temperature or a weight. That is the whole visual trick of a pedigree diagram. It quietly borrows the authority of a real scientific chart, but we have just watched, step by step, how each of those symbols was actually produced. Every black mark was a single moment, when a field worker looked at a person, or heard a story about a person, and simply decided, the chart is not a map of this family's blood. It is a map of Elizabeth Kite's judgments, inked onto paper, and then dressed up to look like genetics. Once you truly see that, the entire thing turns inside out. The chart was presented to the world as proof that defect flows downward through the blood. Read honestly, it is proof of something else completely. It shows that a small number of people, carrying a fixed belief and a great deal of authority, can walk into a poor community and manufacture the exact pattern they already expected to find, and then sign their names to it in the shape of a science. The pedigree does not show heredity at work. It shows bias at work. And this is exactly why the good branch matters so much. The branch that nobody ever bothered to investigate. If those same suspicious field workers had gone knocking on the doors of the respectable Kallikaks, treating every family drinker, and every difficult child, and every business failure as a symptom, they would have turned up plenty of defect there too. Every large family has its troubles buried somewhere. The gap between the two branches was never sitting cleanly in their blood. An enormous share of it was simply in who got hunted and who got trusted. The clean half of the diagram looked clean in large part because no one was ever sent out to dig for its dirt. Goddard, to his credit, was not a stupid man, and some part of him seems to have sensed that the ground beneath him was soft. Late in the book, he actually admitted that he had made statements more dogmatic than his evidence strictly permitted, and he defended it by explaining that he needed to make the point vividly for ordinary readers. Read that confession slowly. The author of the most influential hereditary study of his whole generation was conceding inside the book itself, that he had overstated his certainty on purpose, because he wanted the conclusion to land harder than his data could honestly push it. And it did land harder. It landed harder than nearly any social science of its day. The chart went out into the world and began doing real work, and the work it did was monstrous. The Kallikak Family was published in 1912. Within just a few years, its logic had hardened into actual law. In 1924, the United States passed a sweeping immigration act that slammed the gates shut on the very groups Goddard's Ellis Island numbers had branded defective. That same stretch of years, state after state was writing sterilization statutes, laws that let the government surgically ensure that people it labeled unfit could never have children. And in 1927, that power climbed all the way to the Supreme Court, in a case called Buck versus Bell. The court was asked whether Virginia could sterilize a young woman named Carrie Buck against her will, on the grounds that she, her mother, and her infant daughter were all feeble-minded. By a vote of 8-1, the court said yes. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote the majority opinion, and he closed it with a line that still has the power to stop you cold. 3 generations of imbeciles, he wrote, are enough. That was the intellectual world the Kallikak study had helped to build. A world in which a respected judge could write a sentence like that and pass it off as sober common sense. Across the 20th century, more than 60,000 Americans were sterilized under laws of this kind. Most of them poor, many of them simply inconvenient to somebody with power. And the bitter irony sits right inside that famous case. Legal historians who spent decades digging through the Buck records concluded that Carrie Buck was not feeble-minded either. She was a poor, barely educated teenager who had been institutionalized after a pregnancy that resulted from rape, and the evidence used to condemn her family was, on close inspection, manufactured. And it did not even stay inside America. Goddard's book was translated into German before the First World War, and then reprinted in 1933, the exact year the Nazi Party seized power. German propagandists took the Kallikak family tree, that identical chart, and used it to help sell forced sterilization to their own public, and from there the machinery ground onward into far darker places. A diagram drawn inside a New Jersey institution, to explain one young woman, ended up as a prop in the argument for eliminating the so-called unfit on an entirely different continent. Now hold all of that in your head at once, the immigration walls, the surgeries, the propaganda, the whole towering structure built on top of the chart. And then consider what finally happened when researchers went back and did the plain work that Goddard and Kite had never done. They checked the records, beginning in the 1980s, and then most thoroughly in a full genealogical reconstruction, completed in the year 2001, scholars traced the real family, hiding behind the Kallikak pseudonym. Their real name was Wolverton, and when those real names came climbing up out of the census pages and the property deeds and the old church records, the clean 2-branch story came apart completely. The illegitimate son at the root of the entire bad branch, the supposed product of that nameless tavern girl, lines up with a real man who appears in the documents as the legitimately born son of a married couple. The scandalous origin scene, the whole foundation stone of the experiment, simply does not survive contact with the paperwork. The researchers stated it flatly. Goddard's natural experiment never happened. When the genealogists finally put a real name to that supposed illegitimate son, he turned out to be a man whose parents were both known and both married. A Wolverton by birth, with a documented father and mother of his own. According to the reconstruction, he was actually a second cousin of the very soldier Goddard had cast as the respectable patriarch. The 2 lines the book had cleanly separated into good blood and bad blood were, in the real records, branches of one tangled family, that Goddard's neat diagram had no way to show, and the bad branch itself, that entire black half of the diagram, turns out to be crowded with perfectly ordinary working people, landowners and farmers and tradesmen. Among the descendants of the very people Goddard had filed away as degenerates, later genealogists found schoolteachers, a bank treasurer, a man who owned a lumber yard, and a pilot who flew for the Army Air Corps. These were, on the actual evidence, an ordinary American family. Some of them were poor, most were quietly getting by. A few did well enough to walk clean away from the county and the label entirely. They had been photographed on their worst possible day by visitors who already knew exactly what they wanted to see. There is one more piece of the book that people have fought over for decades, and it deserves careful handling because it is easy to overstate. The photographs, The Kallikak family is illustrated with pictures of the bad branch, poor people posed stiffly outside dark cabins, and the biologist Stephen Jay Gould, writing in 1981, argued that those images had been crudely retouched, that someone had darkened the eyes and hardened the mouths to make the subjects look menacing and dull. Other scholars pushed back hard on that. The psychologist Raymond Fancher countered that retouching was simply routine for the poor photographic printing of the day, and that the altered faces do not actually read as sinister when you test them on ordinary viewers. We should be honest and not claim more than the evidence can support. But whether or not some hand deliberately traced menace onto those faces, the deeper problem does not even need the accusation. These were poor people who never agreed to become the illustrations for a theory about their own inferiority, propped up in front of their worst housing to decorate a scientific point that was already wrong before the shutter ever clicked. And then there is the young woman we started with. For the better part of a century, the world knew her only as Deborah Kallikak, the feeble-minded girl whose defective family had launched a movement. Her real name was Emma Wolverton. She never married and never had children and never once lived on her own. She stayed inside the Vineland institution for the entire length of her long life, sewing and playing in the band and running the gymnasium and writing out her stories, and she died there in 1978 at the age of 89. Of those 89 years, 81 of them were spent behind institution walls. And here is the detail that ought to sit heaviest of all. The people who genuinely knew Emma in her later years did not believe she belonged there. A psychologist who spent real time with her in the 1950s said plainly that Emma was not, by any standard she herself would use, a feeble-minded woman, and that she found her interesting and rewarding to talk with. Modern researchers who have combed back through the entire record have landed on the same conclusion. The woman whose supposed defect set all of this in motion very likely had no intellectual disability at all. She was a poor child out of an almshouse who tested badly one single afternoon and was never once permitted to be anything else again. There is something almost unbearable in the sheer length of it. Emma Wolverton outlived the entire theory that had caged her. She was still living quietly at Vineland through the 1950s and into the 1960s, decades after serious scientists had abandoned the notion that a family tree could be read this way. Decades after her own diagnosis would have been dismissed by anyone who actually sat down with her. For most of that time, she remained, to the outside world, an anonymous case study, the girl from the book, her real face and her real name kept out of sight, while her invented one went on doing damage in classrooms she would never enter. She had become the most famous feeble-minded person in America, and by the best evidence we now have, she never was one. Even Goddard, in the end, quietly backed away from it. By 1928, 16 full years after the book, he had changed his mind about the very core of his own theory. He wrote that feeble-mindedness was probably not incurable after all, that most of the people he had once wanted to lock away did not need to be segregated at all, and, in a genuinely startling line for the man who had led the charge, that he feared he had gone over to the enemy. But he confessed it softly, in professional journals that ordinary people never read. The chart did not follow him into his quiet retirement. It was already loose in the world, sitting in the textbooks and the courtrooms and the German reprints, doing its work without him. And it kept right on doing that work, long after its own author had stopped believing a word of it. So go back to the chart one final time, and really look at what it always was. It looked like science, because it looked like a diagram. 2 clean descending lines, hundreds of tidy little symbols, one dramatic split at the very top. It took a sprawling, tangled, contradictory web of actual human beings, thousands of lives stuffed full of work and poverty and love and rotten luck, and it flattened every bit of that down into squares and circles you could absorb in a single glance. That flattening was the entire source of its power. A real person is complicated and genuinely hard to judge. A black square stamped with a letter is simple, and simple is what travels. Simple gets into the textbooks. Simple wins the argument inside the hearing room. The chart persuaded a nation precisely because of everything it left off the page. And that is the quiet lesson sitting underneath the whole Kallikak story, the one actually worth carrying out of it. The most dangerous kind of bad science is the kind that looks like a clean chart. When a messy human question suddenly resolves into a tidy diagram with a clear villain at the bottom of it, that neatness deserves suspicion rather than trust. It can be the mark of a real discovery. It can just as easily be a measure of how much somebody had to erase to make the picture come out that clean. Emma Wolverton spent 81 years behind institution walls as a single black mark on that diagram. The man who put her there eventually admitted, in his own careful way, that he had pushed his certainty far past his evidence, and the chart that turned one ordinary family into a national warning is now studied for the exact opposite reason it was drawn, as one of the clearest examples we have of a science that saw only what it already wanted to see. If a story like this one is worth remembering, it is worth passing along. So if you found your way all the way to the end of this, take a second to subscribe, and we will keep pulling these histories back up out of the record where they have been quietly sitting all along.